The morning mist hung thick over the Mekong Delta as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her medical pack one final time. The weight of supplies pressed against her shoulders, but she had learned long ago that every bandage, every vial of morphine, every suture could mean the difference between a Marine going home or never seeing his family again. At 26, Maria had already seen more combat than most soldiers twice her age, but nothing had prepared her for what would unfold along the muddy banks of the Nam Dong River. The convoy of 12 Humvees rolled through the Vietnamese countryside in the early dawn hours, carrying Alpha Company's 3rd Battalion toward what intelligence reports claimed was a routine supply delivery to Firebase Charlie. The mission seemed straightforward enough: deliver ammunition and medical supplies to the isolated outpost, conduct a brief patrol of the surrounding area, and return to base before nightfall. Maria rode in the 4th vehicle, her trained eyes scanning the tree line while her hands unconsciously checked her medical equipment for the 100th time that morning. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a career Marine with 23 years of service, led the convoy from the front vehicle. His weathered face showed the strain of countless missions, but his voice remained steady as he radioed position reports back to headquarters. Morrison had specifically requested Maria for this mission after hearing about her heroic actions during the siege at Dong Ha, where she had saved 17 wounded Marines under heavy enemy fire. He knew that if anything went wrong, having the best combat medic in the battalion could make all the difference. The landscape around them seemed peaceful enough: rice paddies stretched toward distant hills, punctuated by small villages where children waved at the passing vehicles. Water buffalo grazed in the flooded fields, their massive forms creating ripples that caught the morning light. Maria found herself thinking about her younger brother Miguel back in San Antonio, who would be starting his senior year of high school soon. She had promised to be home for his graduation, a promise that seemed increasingly difficult to keep as her tour of duty stretched longer than expected. Sergeant Tommy Chen, riding beside Maria in the Humvee, noticed her distant expression. "Penny for your thoughts, Doc," he said, using the nickname that had followed her throughout her military career. Chen was one of the Marines she had saved at Dong Ha, and he had appointed himself as her unofficial bodyguard ever since. The young man from Seattle had joined the Marines to escape a life of poverty, but found himself in Vietnam fighting a war he barely understood. "Just thinking about home," Maria replied, adjusting the radio headset that kept her in contact with all the vehicles in the convoy. "My brother's going to graduate high school soon. He wants to study medicine, maybe become a doctor like he thinks I am." She smiled slightly at the irony. While she had extensive medical training, she was still technically a corpsman, not a doctor. But, to the Marines she treated, the distinction mattered little. The convoy approached the Nam Dong River crossing just after 10 in the morning. The bridge was a temporary structure built by Army engineers 6 months earlier, constructed from steel beams and wooden planking that barely looked capable of supporting the weight of the heavily loaded vehicles. The river below moved swiftly, swollen from recent monsoon rains that had turned the normally lazy waterway into a rushing torrent of brown water filled with debris from upstream. Morrison called for a halt at the bridge approach, following standard protocol for river crossings in hostile territory. 2 Marines from each vehicle dismounted to provide security while engineers checked the bridge structure for signs of sabotage. Maria stepped out of her Humvee, grateful for the chance to stretch her legs and breathe fresh air instead of diesel fumes. The morning heat was already building, and she could feel sweat beginning to form under her helmet. While the engineers conducted their inspection, Maria walked among the Marines, checking on minor injuries and ailments that were common in the humid Vietnamese climate. Private Jackson from Alabama had developed a nasty rash from his equipment rubbing against his neck. Corporal Williams from Detroit complained of recurring headaches that Maria suspected were related to stress rather than any physical condition. These small medical issues were part of her daily routine, but she treated each Marine with the same care and attention she would give to a life-threatening wound. The engineers gave the all-clear signal, and Morrison ordered the convoy to begin crossing. The vehicles would traverse one at a time, with each driver maintaining radio contact throughout the crossing. The bridge creaked and swayed under the weight of each Humvee, but the structure held firm. Maria watched from the eastern bank as the first 3 vehicles successfully made the crossing, their occupants clearly relieved to reach solid ground on the other side. Her vehicle was 4th in line, and, as they began their crossing, Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the far bank, partially hidden among a grove of bamboo trees, she caught a glimpse of sunlight reflecting off what might have been metal. She keyed her radio immediately, trying to warn Morrison, but before she could speak, the world exploded around them. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the bridge supports just as their Humvee reached the center span. The explosion sent chunks of concrete and twisted metal flying through the air, and Maria felt the vehicle lurch violently to one side. The bridge deck tilted at a dangerous angle, but their driver, Corporal Martinez from New Mexico, managed to gun the engine and reached the western bank just as the center span collapsed into the rushing river below. Enemy fire erupted from concealed positions along both banks of the river. Automatic weapons chattered continuously, and more RPGs streaked across the water like deadly fireworks. The three vehicles that had already crossed were trapped on the western bank, cut off from retreat and surrounded by an enemy force that seemed to have materialized from the jungle itself. The remaining 8 vehicles were stranded on the eastern bank, unable to cross the destroyed bridge and exposed to withering fire from their side of the river. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, steady despite the chaos around him. Alpha 6 to all units, we are under heavy attack. Bridge is down. Eastern elements provide covering fire for western elements. We have wounded and need immediate medical attention. Maria's training kicked in automatically. She grabbed her medical bag and began running toward the riverbank, staying low to avoid the bullets that whistled overhead. Through the smoke and confusion, she could see Marines on the western bank taking cover behind their vehicles, returning fire when possible but clearly outnumbered and outgunned. Some were already down, and she could hear the distinctive calls for a medic that had become the soundtrack of her war. The 8 vehicles on the eastern bank formed a defensive perimeter, their crews using the Humvees as cover while they engaged enemy positions in the surrounding jungle. Machine gun fire swept back and forth across the open ground between the tree lines, kicking up geysers of mud and water. Maria realized that the enemy had planned this ambush carefully, positioning forces on both sides of the river to ensure that the Marines would be divided and unable to support each other effectively. Sergeant Chen appeared beside her, his rifle ready. "Doc, we need to get you to cover. This isn't safe." "Those Marines over there need help," Maria replied, pointing across the river where she could see at least 2 wounded men lying motionless near the vehicles. "I have to get to them. The bridge is gone, document. There's no way across." Maria studied the rushing water, calculating distances and currents. The river was perhaps 50 yards wide at this point, but the current was strong and the water was filled with debris from the destroyed bridge. Swimming across would be dangerous under normal circumstances, but attempting it while under enemy fire seemed like suicide. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came over the radio again, more urgent now. "Eastern elements, we have multiple casualties. Request immediate medical evacuation. We cannot hold this position much longer." The sound of incoming mortar rounds added a new dimension to the battle. The enemy was well equipped and well positioned, suggesting this was more than just a chance encounter with a patrol. This was a carefully planned ambush designed to trap and destroy an entire Marine company. Maria realized that without immediate action, all 280 Marines in the convoy would be lost. Through her binoculars, she could see the extent of the trap more clearly. Enemy positions were dug in along both sides of the river for at least a mile in each direction. The Marines on the western bank were completely surrounded, with no avenue of escape except back across the river. But the destroyed bridge made that impossible, and the enemy knew it. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the firefight continued. Maria moved among the Marines on the eastern bank, treating wounds and coordinating medical care while ducking behind cover whenever enemy fire intensified. Every few minutes, she would look across the river at the trapped Marines and feel her frustration grow. She was a medic, her job was to save lives, not to watch helplessly while Marines died because she couldn't reach them. Private Rodriguez, no relation to Maria, despite the shared surname, from Phoenix approached her during a brief lull in the firing. The young Marine was barely 18, fresh out of boot camp and clearly terrified. "Doc, are we going to make it out of here?" Maria looked into his frightened eyes and saw her own brother's face. "We're Marines, Rodriguez. We don't leave our people behind, and we don't give up. Those men across the river are counting on us, and we're not going to let them down." But, privately, Maria knew the situation was desperate. Radio contact with headquarters had been sporadic due to enemy jamming, and any relief force would have to fight through miles of hostile territory to reach them. The Marines on the western bank were running low on ammunition, and their casualties were mounting. Without medical attention, even the wounded who might survive would die from blood loss or shock. As the day wore on, the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. Maria used most of her water supply to treat heat exhaustion among the Marines, knowing that dehydration could be as deadly as enemy bullets in this climate. The enemy seemed content to maintain their positions and wait, letting the heat and lack of supplies do their work for them. During a temporary ceasefire, Maria noticed something that gave her an idea. About 200 yards downstream from the destroyed bridge, a massive tree had fallen across the river, its trunk spanning the water like a natural bridge. The tree was partially submerged and would be slippery, but it might provide a way across. More importantly, it was far enough from the main battle that enemy observation might be limited. She studied the tree through her binoculars, noting the distance she would have to travel through enemy territory to reach it. The route would take her through thick jungle where enemy snipers might be hiding, but it was the only chance she could see to reach the trapped Marines. The tree trunk was perhaps 18 inches in diameter, wide enough to crawl across if she was careful, but narrow enough that one slip would send her into the rushing water below. Chen noticed her intense focus on the downstream area. "What are you thinking, Doc?" "I'm thinking about that tree," Maria replied. "It might be a way across." "That's crazy. You'd never make it through the jungle to reach it, and even if you did, crossing on that log would be suicide." Maria continued studying the terrain, memorizing every detail. "Maybe. But those Marines are going to die if somebody doesn't get medical supplies to them soon. Morrison's been hit, I can tell from his radio transmissions. He's trying to hide it, but I know the signs." The realization that their commanding officer was wounded added urgency to an already desperate situation. Morrison was the kind of leader who would never admit to injury while his men needed him, but Maria's trained ear had detected the subtle changes in his breathing and speech patterns that indicated trauma. If Morrison was seriously wounded, the Western force would lose cohesion quickly. As evening approached, the situation became even more critical. The enemy had brought up additional weapons, including heavy machine guns that made movement almost impossible. Radio intercepts suggested that more enemy forces were moving into the area, preparing to overrun the western bank position during the night. Time was running out for all 280 Marines trapped by the river, and Maria knew that desperate times called for desperate measures. The sun was beginning to set behind the jungle canopy, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that seemed appropriate for the bloody day they had endured. Maria made her decision. She would wait until full darkness provided some concealment, then attempt to reach the fallen tree and cross to the western bank. It was a plan that bordered on impossible, but it was the only plan they had. She began preparing for what might be her final mission, checking and rechecking her medical supplies, studying maps of the area, and trying to estimate how long it would take her to reach the trapped Marines. Chen watched her preparations with growing alarm, but he knew better than to argue with Maria Rodriguez when she had made up her mind to save lives. He had seen her determination before, and he knew that nothing would stop her from trying to reach those wounded Marines across the river. The jungle came alive with nocturnal sounds as darkness settled over the Nam Dong River. Insects buzzed in clouds around the Marines, and somewhere in the distance, a tiger's roar echoed through the trees. Maria had stripped her equipment down to the essentials: medical supplies, ammunition for her sidearm, water, and a small radio. Every ounce mattered when she would be crawling through enemy territory and attempting to cross a river on a fallen log. Captain Stevens, the senior officer on the eastern bank since Morrison was trapped across the river, had initially refused to authorize Maria's mission. "It's suicide, Rodriguez. You'll never make it through their lines, and even if you do, that log crossing looks impossible in the dark." "Sir, with respect, those Marines will be dead by morning if someone doesn't get medical supplies to them," Maria had argued. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison is wounded, and they have at least 15 casualties that need immediate attention. I'm the only medic here with enough combat experience to make it through enemy lines." Stevens knew she was right. The radio reports from the Western Bank had become increasingly desperate as the day progressed. Morrison's voice was definitely weakening, and other Marines were having to take over radio duties more frequently. The enemy was clearly planning a final assault for the pre-dawn hours, and the trapped Marines were running out of both ammunition and medical supplies. After much debate, Stevens had reluctantly agreed to the mission, but only after Maria agreed to take Sergeant Chen with her as security. Chen had volunteered immediately, despite Maria's protests that he would slow her down. "Where you go, I go, document. That's how this works." At 11 p.m., Maria and Chen began their infiltration toward the fallen tree. They moved through the jungle with painstaking care, stopping every few feet to listen for enemy movement. Maria had blackened her face with mud and wrapped her equipment in cloth to prevent any metallic sounds that might give away their position. The weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders, not just for her own safety, but for the 280 Marines whose lives might depend on her success. The journey through enemy territory proved even more dangerous than anticipated. Twice they had to freeze motionless as enemy patrols passed within yards of their hiding spots. Maria could hear the soldiers speaking in Vietnamese, their voices casual as if they were discussing the weather rather than planning to kill American Marines. The enemy was confident, well-organized, and clearly familiar with the terrain. Chen proved his value when they encountered a lone enemy sentry positioned along their route to the river. The Vietnamese soldier was hidden in a spider hole, nearly invisible even at close range. Without Chen's sharp eyes, Maria would have walked directly into the man's line of fire. Instead, Chen was able to eliminate the threat silently, using techniques he had learned in Special Forces training before transferring to the regular Marines. It took them 3 hours to travel the 200 yards to the fallen tree. When they finally reached the riverbank, Maria was horrified by how treacherous the crossing appeared in the darkness. The tree trunk was slick with moisture and algae, and the river rushed beneath it with enough force to sweep away anyone who fell. The sound of the current was loud enough to mask their movements, but it also meant they couldn't hear if enemy soldiers were approaching. "Doc, this is insane," Chen whispered as they studied the makeshift bridge. "That log is maybe a foot and a half wide, it's wet, and it's 30 feet above rushing water. In the dark, you can't even see where you're going." Maria had already begun removing her boots. "I can't swim across with all this medical equipment, and those Marines need these supplies. The log is our only option." She had calculated that crossing the river at this point would put her about half a mile downstream from the trapped Marines. From there, she would have to make her way through more enemy territory, moving upstream along the western bank until she reached Morrison's position. The entire journey would cover nearly 2 miles of hostile terrain, much of it in areas where enemy forces were concentrated. Chen insisted on testing the log first, crawling out about 10 feet to check its stability. The massive tree trunk shifted slightly under his weight, but held firm. "It's solid enough," he reported, "but the surface is like ice. You'll have to go slow and be really careful about your grip." Maria began her crossing at midnight, moving inch by inch along the fallen tree. She kept her medical pack strapped to her back and her rifle slung across her chest, using her hands and knees to maintain contact with the slippery surface. The rushing water below sounded like thunder, and spray from the rapids occasionally splashed up to soak her clothing. Halfway across, disaster nearly struck. A section of bark broke away under her left hand, and, for a terrifying moment, she slipped toward the edge of the log. Only her desperate grab at a protruding branch saved her from falling into the river. She hung there for several seconds, her heart pounding, before managing to pull herself back onto the trunk. Chen watched from the eastern bank, unable to help but ready to create a diversion if enemy forces discovered her. He could barely see her silhouette against the star-filled sky, and every time she paused he feared the worst. The crossing that should have taken 10 minutes stretched to nearly half an hour as Maria fought against fatigue, fear, and the treacherous conditions. When she finally reached the western bank, Maria allowed herself only a moment to catch her breath before beginning the most dangerous part of her journey. The enemy had concentrated most of their forces on this side of the river, knowing that the trapped Marines posed the greatest threat. She would have to move through their positions while staying close enough to the water to maintain her bearings. The first enemy position she encountered was a machine gun nest position to cover the riverbank. 3 Vietnamese soldiers were manning the position, their weapon trained on the area where the Marines were trapped. Maria realized she would have to pass within 20 yards of their position to continue upstream, close enough to hear their whispered conversations. Moving with infinite patience, she crawled through the thick undergrowth, stopping whenever she heard any sound that might indicate she had been detected. The jungle floor was soft with rotting vegetation, which helped muffle her movements but also meant she had to be careful not to disturb any of the many insects and small animals that inhabited the area. A startled bird or disturbed snake could easily give away her position. It took another hour to pass the machine gun nest and continue toward the trapped Marines. Along the way, she discovered just how extensive the enemy preparations were. This wasn't a hastily organized ambush, it was a carefully planned operation that had been in preparation for weeks. The enemy had dug fighting positions, established supply routes, and positioned weapons to create an inescapable killing zone around the river crossing. At 2 a.m., Maria finally reached the edge of the Marine defensive perimeter. She had to be extremely careful in her approach, knowing that the trapped Marines would be trigger-happy after 12 hours under siege. She used her radio to make contact with Morrison's position, identifying herself and requesting permission to approach. Morrison's voice over the radio was noticeably weaker than it had been during the day. "Doc, is that really you? How in hell did you get across that river?" "Long story, sir. I'm about 50 yards from your position with medical supplies. Don't shoot me when I come in." The scene that greeted Maria when she reached the Marine positions was worse than she had feared. The trapped Marines had taken heavy casualties throughout the day, and their makeshift aid station was overflowing with wounded men. Morrison himself was propped against a tree, his left arm clearly broken and his face pale from blood loss. Despite his injuries, he had continued to command the defense, refusing to relinquish control even when other officers suggested he needed medical attention. "Glad to see you, Doc," Morrison said with a weak smile. "We've got 15 wounded, 3 critical. Been trying to keep them stable, but we're out of morphine and almost out of bandages." Maria immediately went to work, triaging the wounded and determining who needed attention first. Private Thompson from Ohio had taken shrapnel in his abdomen and was bleeding internally. Without surgery soon, he would die. Corporal Davis from Georgia had compound fractures in both legs and was going into shock. Sergeant Williams had a head wound that had left him unconscious for several hours. Working by the light of a shaded flashlight, Maria began treating the most critical cases first. She started in 4-line in Thompson's arm and administered morphine to help with his pain, but knew he needed surgical intervention that was beyond her capabilities in the field. Davis required immediate stabilization of his fractures, which meant improvising splints from rifle cleaning rods and torn clothing. While she worked, Maria learned the full extent of their predicament from the other Marines. The enemy had them completely surrounded and had been probing their defenses throughout the night. Ammunition was running low, and several of their weapons had malfunctioned from the humid conditions. The enemy was clearly waiting for dawn to launch their final assault, confident that the Marines would be unable to resist effectively. Morrison insisted on briefing Maria on the tactical situation despite his obvious pain. "They've got us boxed in on 3 sides, with the river on the 4th. Been hearing them moving equipment all night, sounds like they're bringing up mortars or maybe even artillery. We've called for air support, but the weather's closing in and they can't guarantee anything before dawn." The weather was indeed deteriorating. Clouds had moved in during the night, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. A monsoon storm would make any rescue attempt impossible and would also prevent the air support that might be their only chance of survival. Maria realized that time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. As she continued treating the wounded, Maria noticed something that gave her an idea. Many of the Marine casualties were suffering from relatively minor wounds that had become serious due to lack of proper treatment. With adequate medical care, at least half of the wounded could return to the fighting line. If she could stabilize enough of them, Morrison would have additional defenders to help hold their position. She worked through the night with desperate efficiency, using every technique she had learned in 4 years of combat medicine. When her supplies ran low, she improvised, using strips of clothing for bandages, alcohol from Morrison's flask as antiseptic, and even combat rations to create makeshift splints. The Marines watched in amazement as she brought wounded men back from the edge of death through sheer determination and skill. By 4 a.m., Maria had managed to stabilize most of the wounded and return 6 Marines to fighting condition. It wasn't much, but, in their desperate situation, 6 additional rifles could make the difference between survival and destruction. Morrison, though still seriously injured, insisted on remaining in command despite Maria's medical advice. "Doc, you've done miracles here tonight," Morrison told her as dawn approached. "But, we both know this isn't over. When the sun comes up, they're going to hit us with everything they have. We might slow them down, but we can't stop them. Too many of them, not enough of us." Maria understood the mathematics of their situation. Even with the wounded Marines she had returned to duty, Morrison's force was outnumbered at least 5 to 1. The enemy had superior firepower, better positions, and unlimited time to plan their assault. Unless something changed dramatically, the 280 Marines trapped by the river would not see another sunset. But Maria Rodriguez had not crossed enemy lines and risked her life just to watch these Marines die at dawn. As the first hints of light began to appear in the eastern sky, she was already formulating a plan that was even more audacious than her midnight river crossing. If they couldn't escape from their trap, perhaps there was a way to turn the trap against their enemies. The rain was falling steadily now, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Maria looked at the wounded Marine she had treated, at Morrison trying to hide his pain while planning their last stand, and at the young faces of Marines who might not live to see their 20th birthdays. She had made a promise to herself and, to every Marine under her care, no one gets left behind. Now it was time to keep that promise, no matter what the cost. Dawn broke over the Nam Dong River with the ominous rumble of thunder and the steady patter of monsoon rain. Maria had spent the remaining hours before sunrise developing what she privately admitted was probably a suicide mission, but it was their only chance of survival. As the gray light filtered through the jungle canopy, she could see enemy soldiers moving into their final assault positions, and she knew they had perhaps an hour before the attack began. Morrison listened to her plan with growing amazement and horror. "Doc, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You want to go back across that river, through enemy lines again, to coordinate an attack with Stevens from the eastern bank?" "It's not crazy if it works, sir," Maria replied, checking her equipment one more time. "Those Marines on the eastern bank have all the heavy weapons, mortars, machine guns, anti-tank rockets. If they can create a diversion at exactly the right moment, it might give you enough confusion to break out of this trap." The plan was indeed audacious to the point of impossibility. Maria would have to recross the fallen tree bridge, make her way back through enemy territory to reach the eastern bank, convince Captain Stevens to launch a precisely timed assault, and then coordinate the entire operation from a position where she could observe both sides of the battle. The timing would have to be perfect, too early, and the enemy would simply shift their forces to deal with each threat separately. Too late, and Morrison's force would be overrun before Stevens could help. What made the plan even more dangerous was Maria's insistence that she would remain on the western bank during the assault to provide medical support to the Marines who would inevitably be wounded during the breakout attempt. This meant she would have to survive the enemy assault, coordinate the counterattack, and then treat casualties while under fire, all simultaneously. Sergeant Williams, one of the Marines she had returned to fighting condition, volunteered to accompany her on the return journey. "Doc, you saved my life. Let me help you save everybody else's." Maria was tempted to accept his offer, but she knew that Williams was still recovering from his head wound and would slow her down. "I appreciate it, Sergeant, but this is something I have to do alone. You're needed here to help hold the line." At 5:30 a.m., as the rain intensified and provided additional cover, Maria began her second journey across enemy territory. This time, she moved with even greater urgency, knowing that every minute counted. The enemy soldiers were focused on their preparations for the final assault, which provided some concealment, but it also meant there were more of them in the area. The return journey proved even more perilous than her initial crossing. The monsoon rain had turned the jungle floor into a muddy swamp that sucked at her boots and made silent movement almost impossible. Twice she had to detour around enemy positions that hadn't been there during her first trip, losing precious time as she searched for alternate routes through the dense vegetation. When she reached the fallen tree, Maria discovered that the rain had made it even more treacherous than before. The bark was now slick with water and algae, and the river below had risen several feet due to the storm. The current was stronger, and debris was flowing past at dangerous speeds. One slip would be fatal. Halfway across the log, Maria heard voices approaching from the western bank. An enemy patrol was moving along the river, possibly checking defensive positions or looking for ways to outflank Morrison's force. She pressed herself flat against the tree trunk, hoping the darkness and rain would conceal her, as the soldiers passed just yards below her position. The patrol stopped almost directly beneath her, and, for several terrifying minutes, she could hear them discussing something in Vietnamese. Maria didn't speak the language, but their tone suggested they might have spotted something suspicious. She lay motionless on the slippery log, every muscle cramped with tension, as the soldiers searched the area below. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the patrol moved on. Maria waited another few minutes before continuing her crossing, and, when she finally reached the eastern bank, she was soaked, exhausted, and shaking from both cold and adrenaline. But she had made it, and she still had time to implement her desperate plan. Chen was waiting for her at the riverbank, having monitored her radio transmissions during the crossing. "Doc, thank God you made it. Stevens is waiting for you at the command post, but he's not happy about this plan of yours." Captain Stevens was indeed skeptical when Maria presented her proposal. The idea of launching a diversionary assault across the river while Morrison's force attempted a breakout struck him as unnecessarily complicated and dangerous. "Rodriguez, we don't even know if Morrison's people are strong enough to mount an assault. You said yourself that half of them are wounded." "Sir, they're all wounded to some degree, but they're still Marines," Maria replied. "Give them a chance and they'll fight. But they need help, and we're the only ones who can provide it." The tactical situation from the eastern bank looked even more hopeless than it had from Morrison's trapped position. Through binoculars, Stevens could see enemy soldiers moving into final assault positions all around the western perimeter. The Marines were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, and the enemy had brought up additional heavy weapons during the night. Maria spread her map on the muddy ground and began outlining her plan in detail. "The enemy expects us to sit here helplessly while they finish off Morrison's force. They're not prepared for a coordinated assault from both sides. If we hit their eastern positions with everything we have at exactly 0700 hours, it will draw their reserves away from Morrison. That's when his people make their move." Stevens studied the map, his experienced at calculating distances and timing. "Even if this works, Rodriguez, how do we extract Morrison's people? The bridge is gone, and we can't get vehicles across." "The tree bridge, sir. It's narrow and dangerous, but it's the only way. We'll have to get them across one at a time while we hold both sides of the river." Maria knew she was asking Stevens to risk the lives of all 200 Marines on the eastern bank to save the 80 trapped on the western side, but she also knew it was their only chance. The rain was falling harder now, reducing visibility but also providing cover for their movements. Stevens made his decision. "All right, Rodriguez. We'll try your plan. But if this goes wrong, we could lose everybody." The next hour was spent in frantic preparation. Stevens positioned his mortars to target the enemy positions he could identify on the western bank. Machine gun teams were moved to locations where they could provide covering fire for Morrison's breakout attempt. Marines checked and rechecked their weapons, knowing they would have only one chance to save their trapped comrades. Maria established her observation post on a small hill that gave her a view of both sides of the river. From here, she could coordinate the assault using her radio while also monitoring Morrison's situation. It wasn't ideal, she would be exposed to enemy fire and unable to provide direct medical support, but it was the only position that allowed her to see the entire battlefield. At 6:45 a.m., Maria made radio contact with Morrison to coordinate their timing. His voice was weaker than before, but his determination was unchanged. "Doc, we're as ready as we'll ever be. My boys know this is our only shot, and they're not going to let you down. Sir, when you hear our mortars open up, that's your signal to move. Head straight for the river, I'll have covering fire ready when you get there." The minutes crawled by as Maria waited for the appointed time. Through her binoculars, she could see enemy soldiers moving into their final positions, clearly preparing to overrun Morrison's perimeter at dawn. Many of them carried satchel charges and flamethrowers, indicating they planned to eliminate any resistance quickly and brutally. At exactly 7 a.m., Stevens gave the order to commence the diversionary assault. The eastern bank erupted in gunfire as mortars began dropping rounds among the enemy positions. Machine guns swept the western riverbank, forcing enemy soldiers to take cover and disrupting their planned assault. The sound was tremendous, even over the noise of the storm. The enemy response was swift and violent. Return fire immediately began impacting the eastern positions, and Maria could see enemy soldiers running to reinforce the areas under attack. The diversion was working, enemy reserves were being drawn away from Morrison's position. Through the smoke and rain, Maria watched Morrison's Marines begin their desperate breakout attempt. The wounded walked alongside the able-bodied, some leaning on their comrades for support but all carrying weapons and moving with grim determination. They had perhaps 300 yards to cover before reaching the river, and every yard would be contested. Morrison himself led the breakout despite his injuries, refusing to let his men face the danger alone. Maria watched through her binoculars as the lieutenant colonel moved from cover to cover, directing his Marines' movement while enemy bullets snapped through the air around him. His broken arm hung useless at his side, but he carried his rifle in his good hand and never hesitated. The enemy quickly realized what was happening and began shifting forces to intercept the breakout. Machine guns that had been positioned to defend against Stevens' assault were turned toward Morrison's moving column. Maria coordinated counter-battery fire from the eastern bank, but she could see that some of the Marines wouldn't make it to the river. Private Thompson, the young Marine with internal injuries whom Maria had treated during the night, stumbled and fell halfway to the river. Two of his comrades immediately moved to help him, but enemy fire was too intense. Maria watched in horror as all three Marines were cut down just yards from safety. "Stevens, we need more fire on the western positions," Maria called over her radio. "Morrison's people are getting slaughtered." Stevens committed his reserve forces to the assault, sending every available Marine into the battle. The eastern bank became a continuous line of muzzle flashes as every weapon was brought to bear on the enemy positions. The diversionary assault was no longer a diversion, it had become an all-out battle for the survival of both Marine forces. Morrison's column reached the riverbank with heavy losses. Of the 80 Marines who had begun the breakout, only 60 remained capable of fighting. The others were either dead, too wounded to continue, or had remained behind to provide covering fire for their comrades' escape. Morrison himself had taken another wound during the advance, but he continued to command his Marines with unwavering courage. The tree bridge now became the focus of the entire battle. Enemy forces on both sides of the river concentrated their fire on the narrow crossing point, knowing that if they could control it, they could prevent the Marines' escape. Machine gun bullets chewed chunks out of the fallen tree, and mortar rounds exploded in the water below, sending geysers of spray and debris into the air. Maria realized that someone would have to cross the bridge first to secure the eastern landing site and provide covering fire for the other Marines. It was a suicide mission, whoever made that crossing would be completely exposed to enemy fire for the entire duration. But, without it, Morrison's surviving Marines would be trapped on the western bank until enemy reinforcements arrived to finish them off. She was already moving toward the river before she consciously made the decision. Someone had to make that crossing, and, as the only person who had successfully navigated the tree bridge twice, she was the logical choice. Stevens tried to stop her over the radio, but Maria had already switched off her receiver. She had a job to do, and nothing was going to prevent her from completing it. The scene at the riverbank was chaos. Marines provided covering fire while their wounded comrades prepared to attempt the dangerous crossing. Morrison tried one more time to convince Maria to let someone else make the initial crossing, but she was already strapping her medical pack to her back and preparing to begin. "Sir, those Marines on the eastern bank need medical attention as much as these do," she told Morrison. "I'll get across, set up a defensive position, and start treating casualties on that side. Then, we can bring your people over one at a time." Morrison looked at the young medic who had already risked her life multiple times to save his Marines, and he knew that arguing would be useless. Maria Rodriguez had made her decision, and nothing would change her mind. Godspeed, document. See you on the other side. As Maria began her third and most dangerous crossing of the fallen tree, enemy fire intensified dramatically. The enemy had spotted her movement and understood the significance of what she was attempting. Every available weapon was brought to bear on the narrow tree bridge, turning the crossing into a gauntlet of death that would test every skill she had learned in 4 years of combat. The fallen tree bridge became the center of hell as Maria began her final crossing. Enemy machine guns from both sides of the river focused their fire on the narrow log, sending bullets whistling past her head and chipping bark from beneath her hands and knees. The monsoon rain had made the surface even more treacherous, and every inch forward required absolute concentration while death flew around her in metal streams. Halfway across, a sniper's bullet grazed her left shoulder, spinning her halfway around on the slippery log. For a terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge of falling into the rushing water 30 feet below. Only her desperate grab at a protruding branch saved her, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her wounded shoulder. Blood began to seep through her uniform, but she forced herself to continue forward. Behind her on the western bank, Morrison's Marines provided covering fire with everything they had. Their ammunition was running critically low, but they poured rounds into every enemy position they could identify, trying to suppress the fire that threatened to kill their medic. Chen, watching from the eastern bank, felt helpless as he saw Maria struggling to make progress under the intense enemy barrage. A mortar round exploded in the water just below the tree bridge, sending a geyser of mud and debris high into the air. Shrapnel peppered the log around Maria, and the concussion nearly threw her off balance again. She could taste blood in her mouth and feel warm liquid running down her face, but she didn't dare stop to check her injuries. Every second on the bridge was another chance for enemy fire to find her. With 20 yards still to go, disaster struck. An enemy machine gun burst caught the tree bridge directly in front of her, severing several of the smaller branches she had been using for handholds. The impact sent splinters flying, and one large fragment sliced across her right cheek, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding heavily. More critically, the machine gun fire had damaged the structural integrity of the log itself. Maria could feel it shifting under her weight, and she realized that the ancient tree was finally beginning to give way after absorbing so much punishment. If the log broke now, she would fall into the river and be swept away by the current, and Morrison's Marines would remain trapped on the western bank. She pushed herself forward with desperate energy, ignoring the pain from her wounds and the increasing instability of the bridge. Her hands were slick with blood and rain, making it almost impossible to maintain her grip on the wet bark. Her medical pack, soaked with water, felt like it weighed 100 pounds and threatened to drag her off balance with every movement. 15 yards from the eastern bank, Maria heard the distinctive crack of wood under stress. The tree bridge was beginning to split longitudinally, and she could see the gap widening with each passing second. In moments, the log would break completely, taking her down with it and sealing the fate of every Marine still trapped on the western side. Chen couldn't stand by and watch any longer. Despite orders to maintain his position, he sprinted from his cover toward the riverbank, firing his rifle at enemy positions as he ran. Other Marines on the eastern bank saw his movement and began advancing as well, turning Stevens' carefully planned defensive positions into an all-out assault across the entire front. The Marine advance caught the enemy by surprise and disrupted their concentrated fire on the bridge just as Maria made her final desperate lunge for the eastern bank. She covered the last 10 yards in a crawling sprint, reaching solid ground just as the tree bridge finally split completely and crashed into the river below. Maria lay gasping on the muddy riverbank for several precious seconds, her body racked with pain from multiple wounds. But the sound of gunfire reminded her that her job was far from over. The bridge was gone, Morrison's Marines were still trapped, and the battle was raging on both sides of the river with increasing intensity. Chen reached her first, helping her to her feet despite the bullets that continued to snap around them. "Doc, you made it. But how are we going to get the others across now?" Maria looked at the rushing river where the tree bridge had been, then at the Marines on the western bank who were still fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. The conventional bridge was destroyed, the tree bridge was gone, and swimming across would be impossible in the current conditions. But she had promised Morrison that no one would be left behind, and she intended to keep that promise. "We need rope," she told Chen, her mind already working on a new plan. "All the rope we can find, and we need it fast." While Chen organized the collection of every piece of rope, communications wire, and parachute cord available, Maria established a fighting position near the riverbank and began treating the casualties from Stephen's assault. The eastern bank had taken heavy losses during their advance, but their sacrifice had provided the diversion necessary to get her across the river. The rope solution was desperately improvised but potentially workable. By linking together every piece of cordage they could find, the Marines managed to create a line nearly 200 feet long. The plan was to anchor one end on the eastern bank and get the other end across to Morrison's position, creating a zipline that could be used to evacuate the trapped Marines one at a time. Getting the rope across the river proved almost as dangerous as Maria's bridge crossing had been. Corporal Martinez volunteered to swim across with one end of the line, knowing that the current would sweep him downstream but hoping he could reach the western bank before drowning. The young Marine from New Mexico stripped down to his underwear, tied the rope around his waist, and plunged into the racing water. Maria watched through binoculars as Martinez fought against the current, swimming with powerful strokes while the rope played out behind him. Enemy snipers targeted him as soon as they spotted his movement, but the churning water made him a difficult target. Twice he disappeared beneath the surface, only to emerge gasping and still swimming toward the western bank. Martinez made it across, but not where they had hoped. The current carried him nearly 300 yards downstream from Morrison's position, and he had to work his way back upstream through enemy territory while carrying the rope. It took him another 20 minutes to reach Morrison's perimeter, and, by then, the situation on the western bank had become critical. Enemy reinforcements had arrived during the morning, and they were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the remaining Marines. Morrison's ammunition was virtually exhausted, and many of his wounded were unable to fight effectively. The rope line offered hope, but using it would require Marines to cross one at a time while completely exposed to enemy fire. Morrison insisted on sending his most seriously wounded across first, despite the tactical disadvantage this would create. "The walking wounded can still fight," he told Maria over the radio. "Get my boys who can't hold a rifle to safety first." The evacuation began with Private Jackson, the young Marine from Alabama whom Maria had treated for equipment rash just the day before. Jackson had taken shrapnel in his legs during the morning assault and couldn't walk without assistance. He was strapped into a makeshift harness and sent across the zipline while Marines on both sides provided covering fire. The crossing took nearly 5 minutes, with Jackson hanging helplessly beneath the rope while enemy bullets searched for him through the rain and smoke. Twice the line sagged so low that his feet nearly touched the water, but he made it across alive and was immediately taken to Maria's aid station for treatment. One by one, the wounded Marines made the perilous journey across the improvised zipline. Each crossing seemed to take forever, and each man who made it across was one less defender for Morrison's shrinking perimeter. By noon, they had evacuated 12 of the most seriously wounded, but the process was slow and dangerous, and enemy pressure was mounting. The situation reached a crisis point when enemy forces launched their final coordinated assault on Morrison's position. Hundreds of enemy soldiers emerged from the jungle, charging across open ground while machine guns and mortars provided covering fire. Morrison's depleted force fought desperately, but they were simply outnumbered and outgunned. Stevens committed every available Marine on the eastern bank to supporting Morrison's defense, but even their concentrated firepower couldn't stop the enemy advance. Maria watched in horror as enemy soldiers overran sections of Morrison's perimeter, engaging the Marines in hand-to-hand combat among the trees and foxholes. Morrison himself was in the thick of the fighting, using his rifle as a club when his ammunition ran out. Despite his injuries, he refused to retreat, rallying his Marines for one final stand. But Maria could see that their position was hopeless. Within minutes, they would be completely overwhelmed. It was then that salvation came from an unexpected direction. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the battlefield, and through the rain clouds appeared a formation of UH-1 Huey gunships from the 1st Cavalry Division. Air support had finally arrived, guided to the battle by Stevens' radio calls and the visible signs of combat along the river. The gunships swept down like mechanical angels of death, their miniguns and rockets tearing into the enemy assault force. Machine gun bullets designed for anti-aircraft use cut through infantry formations like wheat before a scythe. Within minutes, the enemy attack had been broken, with survivors fleeing back into the jungle. But the helicopters brought more than just firepower, they also brought hope for a complete evacuation. The lead pilot radioed Stevens that they had medical evacuation helicopters standing by and could begin extracting Marines immediately. The battle that had seemed hopeless just minutes before was suddenly winnable. Under cover of the gunships, medical evacuation helicopters began landing on both sides of the river. Maria coordinated the evacuation of the wounded while Stevens and Morrison organized the extraction of their remaining forces. The Marines who had been trapped and surrounded for nearly 24 hours were finally going home. As the last helicopter lifted off from the western bank, Maria looked back at the Nam Dong River where so much had happened in such a short time. They had lost 17 Marines during the battle, brave men who would never see their families again. But 263 Marines were alive because of the desperate gambit that had begun with her midnight river crossing. Morrison, his arm on a proper sling for the first time in 24 hours, found Maria as they waited for their evacuation helicopter. "Doc, I've been a Marine for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did. You saved every man in my unit." Maria was exhausted, wounded, and covered in mud, but she managed a tired smile. "That's what medics do, sir. We don't leave people behind." 3 days later, Maria Rodriguez received the Navy Cross for her actions at Nam Dong River. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." Petty Officer Rodriguez repeatedly crossed enemy lines under heavy fire to provide medical assistance to wounded Marines, displaying courage and dedication above and beyond the call of duty. But, for Maria, the real reward was simpler: 263 Marines had made it home to their families. In the end, that was all that mattered. She had kept her promise, and no one had been left behind. The battle at Nam Dong River became legendary in Marine Corps history, not just for the tactical skill displayed by the Marines involved, but for the extraordinary courage of one medic who refused to accept that anyone was beyond saving. Maria Rodriguez had proven that sometimes, the impossible was simply another word for something that required more courage than most people possessed. Years later, when she finally made it home to San Antonio for her brother's college graduation, Miguel asked her what it had been like in Vietnam. Maria thought for a moment about the tree bridge, the wounded Marines, and the promise she had made to bring everyone home. "It was hard," she said finally. "But sometimes the hardest things are the most important things. And sometimes, when everything seems impossible, that's when you find out what you're really made of."